The antiseptic scent of bleach and sterile gauze was the smell of Nia's life. It clung to her hair, her skin, the fibers of her light blue scrubs. It was a clean smell, a smell of order and control, but today it felt like it was choking her. "Nurse," Dr. Evans said, his voice a low sneer that he reserved just for her. He didn't use her name. He never did. "Did you or did you not record the patient in room 304's fluid output?" Nia kept her eyes on the chart in her hands, her pen hovering over a line. "I did, doctor. It's logged on the digital system, time-stamped at 8:15". "I prefer paper charts. You know this. The system can crash. A pen does not." He tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the counter, the sound like a tiny, insistent hammer against her composure. He was a man who enjoyed the performance of power, especially over the one nurse on the floor who didn't shrink or flutter when he approached. Nia met his gaze. His eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky, and just as cold. "I will update the paper chart immediately." "See that you do," he turned, his white coat swirling around him like a cape, and swept away to terrorize someone else. Another nurse, Maya, sidled up to her, her expression a mix of pity and frustration. "I don't know how you deal with him, Nia. He's been on your case since you started." Nia finally let out the breath she'd been holding. "He's a supervisor. It's his job to supervise." She kept her voice even, professional. Showing weakness to a man like Evans was like bleeding in water with sharks. She had learned long ago, in a life before this one, that composure was armor. But the truth was, it was exhausting. The constant microaggressions, the condescending tone, the way he double-checked her work, and only her work. She was good at her job. She was competent, quick-thinking, and her patients trusted her. But in his eyes, she was a permanent inconvenience. She finished her charting, her movements precise and economical. She was moving toward the medication room when a sound began to permeate the hospital's usual symphony of beeps, quiet conversations, and rolling carts. It was a low, guttural rumble, growing steadily louder. It sounded like a storm approaching, but the sky outside the large windows of the reception area was a placid, cloudless gray. Heads began to turn. Conversations faltered. The rumble grew into the distinct, synchronized thrum of multiple high-performance engines. Then, through the glass doors of the emergency entrance, the source became visible. A black SUV, a gleaming, obsidian Escalade with windows tinted to absolute black, pulled to a stop directly in front of the doors, blocking the ambulance bay. Then another. And another. They filed in with the terrifying precision of a military convoy, one after another, until 10 of them sat idling in a silent, menacing line. They took up the entire driveway, a fleet of polished darkness against the hospital's sterile white facade. The hospital's security guards, 2 men more accustomed to dealing with frantic family members and the occasional drunk, looked at each other with wide, uncertain eyes. One of them spoke into his radio, his voice cracking slightly. The doors of the SUVs opened in perfect unison. From each, 2 men emerged. They were all dressed in identical, impeccably tailored black suits over crisp white shirts. They moved with a shared, disciplined grace, their faces impassive, their eyes scanning the surroundings with a predatory stillness. They formed 2 lines, creating a path from the lead vehicle to the hospital doors. The world inside the ER lobby seemed to hold its breath. Patients in the waiting area lowered their magazines. The receptionist's hands froze over her keyboard. Dr. Evans, who had been berating a junior resident, stopped mid-sentence, his mouth slightly agape. Then, the back door of the lead SUV opened. A man stepped out. He was not large or overtly muscular, but the space around him seemed to warp, to bend to his will. He wore a gray suit, the fabric of fine, sharkskin wool that shifted in the light. It was custom, a brand Nia knew cost more than her car. A Patek Philippe watch gleamed at his wrist, a subtle declaration of obscene wealth. His black hair was expertly cut, every strand in place. But it was his face, his posture, that commanded absolute attention. His features were sharp, carved from granite and shadow. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes so dark they seemed to drink the light. He moved with an unnerving economy of motion, each step deliberate, radiating an aura of lethal control. The air itself seemed to grow colder, heavier, as he walked through the path his men had created. He entered the emergency room, and the silence that had fallen became absolute. It was no longer a pause in the day's noise. It was a vacuum, a void created by his presence. His dark eyes swept the room once, a quick, dismissive inventory of the space and the people in it. He ignored the stunned faces, the security guard fumbling with his radio, the doctors and nurses frozen in place. His gaze found Nia. Across the bustling floor, through the chaos of gurneys and four stands, his eyes locked onto hers. And in that moment, the entire world fell away. The hospital, Dr. Evans, the 10 SUVs, it all became background noise. There was only the silent, unyielding pull of his stare. Kwon Jin-woo. He said nothing.
He didn't need to.
He simply started walking toward her. His men remained by the doors, a silent, black-clad army standing guard. Jin-woo moved through the ER as if it were his own private domain, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the linoleum floor. Dr. Evans, recovering his bluster, stepped forward. It was a foolish, reflexive assertion of his own perceived authority. "Sir, you can't just." Jin-woo didn't even look at him. One of his men, a man with a thin scar bisecting his eyebrow, materialized at Evans's side. The man didn't touch the doctor. He simply stood there, his presence a clear, unspoken threat. Evans's mouth clicked shut. His face paled. Jin-woo stopped a few feet from Nia. The scent of his cologne reached her, a subtle, expensive mix of cedarwood and smoke. It was a scent she knew intimately, a scent that belonged to late nights in his penthouse overlooking the Han River, to quiet moments that felt like they existed in a separate reality. A reality that had just crashed, with violent force, into this one. "Nia," he said. Her name. He said her name, and the sound of it in his low, resonant voice was a brand. It was a claim. It wasn't the way her colleagues said it, or even her friends. He said it like he owned it. Like he owned her. And in the stunned, ringing silence of the emergency room, every single person, from the janitor mopping the floors to the chief of surgery, finally understood. They didn't know who he was, not exactly, but they understood the unmistakable language of power. Nia's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her expression remained a carefully constructed mask of professional calm. She looked at the man who was her fiancé, the head of the Korean syndicate that ran half of Seoul's underworld, standing in the middle of her mundane, fluorescent-lit world. "Jin-woo," she replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the storm raging inside her. "What are you doing here?" He took another step closer, his gaze dropping to the clipboard she still held in a white-knuckled grip. He gently took it from her, his fingers brushing against hers. The brief contact was like an electric shock. He glanced at the chart, then at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes. "There's been a complication," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "I need you." That was the moment the floor dropped out from under her world. This wasn't a social call. This wasn't a grand, romantic gesture. This was business. His business. And he had just dragged it, and all its inherent danger, into the one place she had believed she was safe. The man with the scar approached Jin-woo, whispering something in his ear. Jin-woo's expression hardened, becoming even more remote. He gave a short, sharp nod. "We have a secured room," he said to Nia, his tone leaving no room for argument. "My head of security, Mr. Park, was injured. The bullet needs to come out. Now." Nia's training took over, a blessed wave of professional instinct that drowned out the panic. An injury. A bullet. That was a language she understood. "The surgeons here are the best in the city. He needs a proper operating theater." "No," Jin-woo said, the word absolute. "No hospital records. No outside surgeons. Just you." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the crack in his marble facade. It was a sliver of desperation, of vulnerability, and it was aimed directly at her. "I trust you." The weight of those 3 words was heavier than any threat. Trust in his world was a currency more valuable than gold, and far more rare. He was placing the life of one of his most important men in her hands. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice crisp and professional. "They're bringing him in through a service entrance. A private suite on the top floor has been acquired." Acquired. She knew what that meant. Money, intimidation, or a combination of both had cleared a space for them. The hospital had unknowingly become a black site for the syndicate. She gave a curt nod. "I'll need a full surgical kit, a portable monitor, plasma, and a crash cart. Tell your men what to get from the supply closets. They'll need my authorization code." She rattled it off without hesitation. As she turned to lead the way, she passed Dr. Evans. He was staring, his face a comical mixture of fear and disbelief. His washed-out eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw no condescension. Only raw, unadulterated shock. He looked from her to the terrifyingly still man in the gray suit, and a dawning, horrified comprehension spread across his features. That was when Nia realized her old life was over. It had ended the moment the first SUV had rolled to a stop. She was no longer just a nurse who was good at her job. She was the fiancée of Kwon Jinwoo. And in his world, there were no half-measures. The private suite was one of the luxury rooms reserved for wealthy donors, a space more like a 5-star hotel than a hospital room. Jinwoo's men had been brutally efficient. The floral arrangements and complimentary fruit basket had been swept aside. Sterile drapes covered the plush furniture. 2 of his men, stoic and silent, stood guard outside the door. Inside, another man was setting up equipment he'd procured from the supply rooms with an unnerving speed. On the bed, stripped of its fine linens and covered with a sterile sheet, lay Mr. Park. He was a man Nia recognized, a formidable presence who was always at Jinwoo's side. Now he was pale, his breath coming in shallow, pained gasps. His suit jacket and shirt had been cut away, revealing a blood-soaked makeshift bandage on his abdomen. Nia snapped on a pair of gloves, her mind shifting into a purely clinical state. This was her domain. Here, she was the one in control. Vitals. The man setting up the equipment answered without looking up. Blood pressure is 90/50 and dropping. Pulse is 130. Too low. Too fast. He was bleeding out internally. He needs a surgeon, Jinwoo. I'm a nurse. I can stabilize him, I can assist, but removing a bullet from the abdomen is not something I can do alone. You will not be alone, Jinwoo said. His voice was calm, but his hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. He was watching Mr. Park, his expression a mask of cold fury. Our doctor is on his way. He was delayed. But the bleeding won't wait. You need to stop it. Nia moved to the bedside, her hands quick and sure as she cut away the rest of the bandage. The entry wound was small, deceptively clean, just below the ribcage on his left side. There was no exit wound. It's likely hit the spleen or a kidney, she murmured, more to herself than to him. She pressed gauze to the wound, applying pressure. Who did this? The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken implications. A rival, Jinwoo said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. But Nia knew him. She could hear the rage simmering beneath the ice. They've been testing our borders for months. This was an escalation. They ambushed his car, he paused, his gaze shifting from Mr. Park to her. It was a message. Meant for me. Nia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's air conditioning. A message. Mr. Park was dying on this bed as a message. Someone from the inside gave them his route. Jinwoo continued, his voice dropping lower. A traitor. That was his wound. Not a physical one, but the deeper, more corrosive wound of betrayal. In his world, loyalty was absolute. Betrayal was a death sentence. The failure to protect his own, especially a man as trusted as Mr. Park, was a stain on his honor. He had failed to see the snake in his own house. Nia worked, her focus narrowing to the man on the bed. She started in 4-line, pushing fluids to get his pressure up. She attached the leads for the heart monitor, the steady, rapid beep filling the tense silence. She was in her element, a small island of competence in an ocean of violence. Jin-woo watched her every move. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the efficiency of her hands, the calm authority in her voice as she gave orders to his men. He was seeing a side of her he had only ever heard about. He had known she was a nurse, had respected her choice of profession, but he had never seen her in it. He was seeing the steel beneath her quiet exterior, and it was something he recognized. It was a different form of the same strength he demanded from his own soldiers. She looked up, her gaze meeting his. The professional mask was still in place, but behind it, he saw the flicker of fear, of anger, of a woman whose life had been violently upended. "Your doctor had better get here soon," she said, her voice tight. "Or you're going to be burying your head of security." The door opened, and a harried-looking older man with a medical bag was escorted in. The syndicate's doctor. He nodded to Jin-woo, then immediately turned his attention to Nia and the patient. "Report," the doctor said to her, his tone respectful, professional. Nia didn't miss a beat. She rattled off Mr. Park's vitals, his likely injuries, the interventions she had already performed. The doctor listened intently, nodding. He opened his bag, revealing a set of surgical tools far more comprehensive than anything from a hospital supply closet. "You've kept him alive," the doctor said, glancing at her with newfound respect. "Good work. Now I need you to assist me. We're doing this right here." For the next hour, the hotel-like room became an operating theater. Nia worked seamlessly with the syndicate doctor, her hands steady, her mind sharp. She anticipated his needs, handing him instruments, monitoring vitals, keeping the patient stable. She was no longer just Nia, the nurse Dr. Evans belittled. She was a critical part of a life-saving operation in the heart of a criminal underworld. Jin-woo never left the room. He stood against the far wall, a silent, unmoving statue of coiled tension. He watched her work, his dark eyes tracking her every move. He saw the smear of blood on her cheek she was unaware of, the fierce concentration that made her forget everything but the task at hand. He was seeing the woman he intended to marry not as a soft civilian to be protected, but as a warrior in her own right. When it was over, the bullet was out, the bleeding was stopped, and Mr. Park was stabilized. The doctor began dressing the wound, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion and relief. Nia finally stepped back, peeling off her bloody gloves. Her muscles ached. Her mind was buzzing with adrenaline. She looked at Jin-woo, who was still watching her. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with everything that had just happened, and everything that was about to. She could have left then. The doctor was there, Mr. Park was stable. She could have walked out of the room, out of the hospital, and tried to disappear. She could have made a choice to run from this life that had just shown her its ugliest, most violent face. But she looked at Jin-woo, at the fatigue and cold fury in his eyes, at the silent admission of vulnerability he had shown by bringing this problem to her, and she knew she wasn't going anywhere. She had crossed a line. She had actively participated, using her skills to save one of his men. She was complicit. She walked over to the small sink in the room's bathroom and began to scrub her hands, the water running red. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back was still wearing the light blue scrubs of her old life, but her eyes were different. Harder. Wiser. That was the moment she made a deliberate choice. It wasn't a choice to be a gangster's wife. It was a choice to stand with the man she loved, regardless of the blood and the danger. She chose him. She dried her hands and walked back into the main room. Jin-woo was now at Mr. Park's bedside, his hand resting briefly on his soldier's shoulder. It was a gesture of immense significance, a silent promise of vengeance. He turned as she approached. They stood less than a foot apart, the air crackling with a tension that had nothing to do with the medical emergency. It was something more personal, more charged. "You should go," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It is not safe here." "And go where, Jin-woo?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Back downstairs to pretend none of this happened?" To let Dr. Evans write me up for abandoning my post. A humorless smile touched her lips. I think that life is over. His eyes searched hers. He saw no fear, no regret. Only a startling, resolute strength. Nia, he began, but he didn't seem to know what to say.
So she said it for him.
I'm not leaving. That was their first charged moment, born not of romance, but of shared crisis. It was a silent acknowledgement that the wall between their two worlds had been irrevocably breached, and she was choosing to stay on his side of the rubble. The hours that followed bled into one another. Mr. Park remained stable but unconscious. Jean Woo's doctor stayed to monitor him. Jean Woo himself became a predator in a cage, pacing the confines of the suite, his phone buzzing intermittently with clipped, coded updates from his men who were hunting the traitor. Nia, running on fumes and adrenaline, did what she knew best. She cared for her patient. She checked Mr. Park's vitals, changed his dressings, and managed his IVs. The routine of it was a comfort, an anchor in the storm. Around dawn, the danger escalated. Jean Woo received a call. His face, already grim, became a mask of ice. He ended the call without a word and looked at Nia. They know we're here, he said. Not a question. A statement. The traitor gave them everything. A new kind of fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Nia's exhaustion. This wasn't an abstract threat anymore. The rival faction, the men who had put the bullet in Mr. Park, were coming here. To the hospital. We have to move him, she said immediately, her mind racing. We can't defend this position. Moving him is a death sentence in his condition, the doctor interjected, his face pale. And my people are still trying to secure a route out of the city. They were trapped. Jean Woo's gaze fell on a schematic of the hospital floor plans one of his men had procured. His finger traced a path. The old surgical wing. It was shut down for renovations 2 years ago, but never completed. It's a dead zone. No cameras, no staff. How do we get him there?
Nia asked.
We create a diversion, Jean Woo said, his eyes glinting with tactical coldness. That's when Nia did something she never would have imagined possible. The idea bloomed in her mind, a dark and dangerous flower. It was morally gray, a flagrant violation of every professional ethic she held dear, but it was also their only chance. I can do it, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I can create a diversion, she looked at Jean Woo. I can trigger a hospital-wide alert. A code gray. It means a combative person, a security threat. It will draw all hospital security and any police presence to the main lobby. Jean Woo stared at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes.
How?
Dr. Evans, she said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. He's arrogant. He thinks he's untouchable. And he's terrified of you. I can use that. She walked out of the suite, leaving a stunned Jean Woo in her wake. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her steps were steady. She found Dr. Evans in the staff lounge, looking pale and jittery. Doctor, she said, her voice calm. The man upstairs, Mr. Kwan. He wants to see you. Fear warred with ego on Evans's face. Why would he want to see me? He wants to thank you personally for the hospital's discretion, Nia lied smoothly. He's a very generous man. He's talking about making a significant donation to your department. Greed won. Evans puffed out his chest and followed her. She led him not to the suite, but to an empty examination room nearby. The moment he was inside, she stepped back out and keyed a code into the wall panel. The lock clicked shut. She then picked up the internal phone and dialed security. This is Nurse Nia James on the 5th floor, she said, her voice a perfect imitation of panic. Code gray. Dr. Evans is being held hostage in exam room 5. The man is armed. I repeat, code gray. She hung up before they could ask questions. Alarms began to blare throughout the hospital. On the overhead system, a calm female voice announced the code, directing all staff to remain in place and all security to respond to the 5th floor lobby. She had just framed her supervisor for a hostage situation to create a diversion for the Korean Mafia. She had crossed a line she could never, ever uncross. She raced back to the suite. Jean Woo's men were already moving, transferring a still unconscious Mr. Park to a gurney. Jinwoo looked at her, his expression intense. He knew what she had done. "Go," she urged. "You have maybe 10 minutes. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful. He pulled her closer, his dark eyes boring into hers. The scent of cedar and smoke filled her senses. "You should have run," he said, his voice a low, rough growl. "The moment you saw my car. Why didn't you run?" It was the confession. Not of love, but of something deeper, more dangerous. It was his admission that he had brought this darkness to her door, and his shock that she hadn't fled from it. Nia looked up at him, her heart aching with a truth she could no longer deny. "I told myself staying was for the patient," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I was lying to myself." The admission hung between them, more intimate than a kiss. He saw it in her eyes, the same fierce, unwavering loyalty he demanded from his men, given to him freely. Before he could respond, one of his soldiers appeared at the door. "They're here." They used a contractor's entrance. The rival faction was inside the hospital, and they were no longer just targeting Jinwoo. They knew who had helped him. They knew about the nurse. Jinwoo's face became a mask of lethal calm. "Get him to the old wing." Now he looked at Nia. "You stay with me."
It was not a request.
It was an order, an act of possession. He pulled her behind him as his men wheeled Mr. Park out a service door, and the first gunshots echoed from down the hallway. The enemy had made their move, and they were targeting him by targeting the one thing he could not afford to lose. Her. The climax was not a grand shootout in the lobby. It was a desperate, terrifying game of cat and mouse in the echoing, dust-filled corridors of the abandoned surgical wing. Jinwoo moved with a fluid, predatory grace, a handgun appearing in his hand as if by magic. He pushed Nia ahead of him, his body a constant shield at her back. They were cornered in what was once an operating theater. The door wouldn't hold for long. 2 of Jinwoo's men were outside, holding the line, but the sound of gunfire was getting closer. Inside, the doctor was frantically checking Mr. Park's vitals on a portable monitor. "His heart rate is becoming erratic," the doctor shouted over the noise. "He's going into cardiac arrest." Jinwoo swore, his attention torn between the threat at the door and the man dying on the gurney. Nia's mind went into overdrive.
No crash cart. No defibrillator.
They were out of time and options. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on a discarded piece of equipment in the corner. A portable YESU, an electrosurgical unit, left behind by the renovation crews. Its cables were frayed, but the power light was on. "The YESU," she said, her voice sharp with authority. Jinwoo looked at her. "It delivers a high-frequency electrical current. If I can modify the paddles, I can use it as a makeshift defibrillator. It's a massive risk. It could kill him." "Do it," Jinwoo said without a moment's hesitation, his trust in her absolute. While Jinwoo and his remaining man braced the door, Nia worked with a frantic, focused energy. She stripped the wires, her nursing knowledge combining with a desperate ingenuity she never knew she possessed. The doctor watched, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe.
"Clear," she yelled.
She pressed the exposed wires to Mr. Park's chest. His body convulsed violently on the gurney. The monitor flatlined, a long, piercing tone that cut through the sound of splintering wood at the door. "Again," she commanded, her own heart pounding.
She shocked him again.
The line on the monitor jumped.
Once. Twice.
Then settled into a weak but steady rhythm. At that exact moment, the door burst open. 2 men, armed and dressed in black, stormed in. Nia didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She acted. She grabbed a heavy, stainless steel tray of discarded instruments and hurled it at the first man, catching him in the face. He staggered back, momentarily stunned. Jinwoo was already moving. He was a blur of gray and black, a phantom of violence. 2 precise shots, and the intruders fell. He didn't waste a bullet. He didn't waste emotion. It was over in seconds. Silence descended, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor and their own ragged breaths. Nia stood, her chest heaving, the bloody tray at her feet. She had saved a man's life with a piece of junk, and then she had assaulted another. She looked at the blood, the bodies, and the man she loved, who moved through this world of death as if he were born to it. Jin-woo walked toward her, his gun now lowered. He stopped in front of her, his eyes scanning her for any injury. He reached out and gently brushed the smear of dried blood from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was surprisingly soft.
"It is done," he said.
His men had dealt with the rest of the rival team. The traitor had been found. The threat was over. He looked from her to the stabilized Mr. Park, then back to her. His expression was one she had never seen before. It was raw, stripped of all its usual defenses.
It was awe.
My entire empire, he said, his voice low and thick with emotion, is built on loyalty and strength, on soldiers who can fight and kill. But today, you are the most dangerous person in this room. It was not a declaration of love. It was something more. It was his acknowledgement of what she was to him. An equal, a partner, a queen for his blood-soaked kingdom. A cost had been paid. Her old life was incinerated. Dr. Evans would be found, his career and reputation in tatters from the false hostage report, a price he paid for his arrogance. The hospital would be locked down, a crime scene. She could never walk back through those doors as a nurse. Jin-woo held out his hand. "Come with me, Nia." It was the choice laid bare. Stay and face the impossible wreckage of her life, or step fully into his. She looked at her light blue scrubs, now stained with another man's blood. They were a costume from a life that no longer fit her. Then she looked at Jin-woo, her anchor in the chaos. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, a firm, possessive grip. A promise. He led her out of the abandoned wing, past his silent, respectful men, and toward a secure exit where another black car was waiting. As she stepped out into the pre-dawn air, the city lights felt like a distant galaxy. She slid into the plush leather seat of the Maybach. The door closed with a soft, final click, sealing her inside his world. The car pulled away from the hospital, a sterile white monolith in the rearview mirror, shrinking with every passing second. Nia didn't look back. She looked forward, at the reflection of her own face in the tinted window, and the face of the man beside her, his hand still holding hers, an unbreakable claim. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning.